Hello, my name is Jordan Postorino, and welcome to a brand new show on my channel, which is entitled Giordash Recreates. And today we've got a very special track that I have endeavored to recreate, which is Breathe by the Prodigy. I have always loved this song, and like with many other songs that I love, sometimes what I'll do is really dive into the track and try to recreate it from a production standpoint to try to understand a little bit more about the choices that were made and how I might be able to use some of those techniques in my own productions. And I find it's generally just a really great exercise for producers, for creatives, working inside any DAW, whether it's Ableton or Logic or Pro Tools, to try to isolate the parts of a song that you hear, and if you can recreate them or at least get close, then you have a whole new skill set in your bag of tricks, so to speak. So today we are going to be having a look at my recreation of Breathe by Prodigy. I'm going to let the track play. I'm going to play all of this kind of arrangement that I've created, and we'll have a listen to it, and then we'll go track by track in order of appearance and take a look at each track piece by piece kind of thing. Here is Breathe by Prodigy. You can see in my session here I've got all manner of different tracks. I also have the original up here in yellow, and I'm going to try my best not to play it for fear of copyright issues on YouTube. I feel as though we're all pretty familiar with this track. If you're watching this video, you probably know it already, and there won't really be too much referencing that we have to do. If you want to reference to the original, I'm sure you can do that on your own. So here is my recreation of Breathe by Prodigy. Okay, so there it is. There's my recreation of Breathe. I had a lot of fun doing it. It was pretty stressful at times. I'm not gonna lie, there were a few times where I wanted to pull my hair out, but you persevere, you keep going, and if you can see your way through it, you get something pretty special in the end. And I feel like this is a pretty accurate recreation of what's going on in the track. And before we jump in, just to preface kind of like, how would you go about doing this? Like, what are the things you need to look forward to execute a recreation of this type? First and foremost is understanding the idiom of the music that you're trying to recreate. Obviously with Prodigy, it's sampled music. It's music that, much like hip hop, is created from the aggressive and continuous sort of sampling and resampling of old records. And so you can see here, if you just take a look at some of the titles of these tracks, for instance, the active loop in the song is this one here called Hall 162. And when I was doing my research for this song, there were people pointing to a lot of different loops that this could be. There were some people saying that it came from a James Brown song. There were some people saying that it was very simply just an amen break. A lot of people had a lot of different theories as to where this came from. And so basically, okay, well, I have 5 or 6 different answers for this question. I'm going to grab all 5 of those things and see which one kind of fits the best. And there was one forum I was looking on that said that this one loop, Paul 162, which is from the original Jungle Warfare sample pack, is the one that Liam Howlett ended up using. And I stand by that. I think that's exactly correct. To me, it does not sound like a James Brown break. It does not sound like an amen break. It sounds like this one thing. So you'll see around the session here that there's some tracks that are straight up samples ripped from records. Like for instance, this Thin Lizzy Crazy, Johnny the Fox, like this is literally just the opening drum break from that song. We have the horns from Sing a Simple Song. The sword sounds are from Mystery of Chess Boxing by Wu-Tang Clan. Like you'll see a lot of the titles for the songs. The John Barry Orchestra. There was one forum I came across where it said the original lead sound that starts the song off also came from the John Barry Orchestra original James Bond theme, but I couldn't seem to make that work. And you probably saw when I was scrolling through here, when I got to sort of the beginning here, that Serum is kind of the thing that's taking care of the main lead. But yeah, there's a lot of very disparate sort of influences, not only with regards to sampling, but also sound design. I'm pretty sure that Liam Howlett was also using synthesizers, also recording things, right? There's that distorted guitar that comes in. Pretty sure someone played that. So there's a lot of kind of piecing together that you have to do with this kind of a recreation, but you will see the fruits of your labor. So I think what we should do is have a look track by track and see what's going on. So the very first thing I did with the song, and probably what I spent the most of my time on, was this Serum patch. So it sounds like this. And you can see there's a lot of processing. There's a lot of very minimal sort of tweaks going on and little automation things to really try to sit it in the right spot. It's a very specific lead sound. There's also some space that exists around it that I wasn't quite able to pin down. But in terms of the Serum patch, it's very, very simple. You know, there's really not a lot going on. All of the oscillators are being used. So we have A and B. We have this dull toy waveform, and then we also have this MB triangle metal waveform. And yeah, I'm doing a lot of really kind of tweaky, wacky things with it. There's some modulation going on here and there, but oddly enough, not on the actual oscillators. It's actually all in this filter section. So there's also a fair amount of processing after Serum. So what I'm going to do, you just saw I turned that off. Let's just listen to Serum on its own. So that's kind of where I ended up just with Serum. And I thought that was close enough to where I could just probably get the rest of the way with processing. That's kind of how Serum is sitting. Turning off some of these oscillators, we'll be able to hear a little bit better what's going on. First and foremost, this sub oscillator is driving the bus a fair amount. We're doing ring modulation from B. This sort of combination of sub oscillator A and oscillator B sounds like this, which is like, that's almost it, right? Then we have some noise. Again, very subtle. And this filter is really where everything's happening. Like a lot of these LFO shapes are going to this filter. And also the envelope is, again, very simple. We have moderately low sustain, a little bit of attack, a little bit of decay, classic sort of like ADSR envelope for an attack pluck and, you know, sort of medium sustain. Going over to effects, we've got a little bit of filtering, a little bit of distortion, little multiband compression, nothing really crazy here. I can turn this stuff off so you can hear it. So that's without effects. So we can hear actually the effects do a lot. So we're filtering some stuff out. We're adding some distortion. And then we're just kind of compressing it all, but only really mixing in a little bit of that multiband compression. The same thing with this distortion here. It's really just coming up on LFO1. So yeah, LFO1 is controlling that mix knob. And if you want to see what like everything is doing, in other words, what is controlling what in a complete sense, we can go to the matrix and you can see LFO1 is kind of doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. So it's doing all this filter, movement, noise level. We've got LFO2 and 3 kind of doing some work too, but they're kind of more utility LFOs. This LFO2 on the master tuning is to just give, I remember hearing that on the sort of the eighth note side of the pluck, the down, 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 there was this like thing that I was missing, like a little bit of almost a secondary pluck. And so I just sort of grabbed an LFO and created a shape that I could assign to the master tuning just to kind of give us a really quick ramp down, kind of like you do with a pitch envelope if you're making a kick. And yeah, again, a lot of this filter movement is coming from this LFO1. You can see really LFO2 and LFO3 only have one destination per. LFO1 has 7. So that's kind of where we're at with just Serum. Now, if I turn on some of this post-processing, I have it kind of grouped within a group so I can audition it, so to speak. But what I'll do is I'll turn all of them off and then we'll just kind of go in order of appearance with these guys. So first up is amp. Regular Serum sounds like this. Then we've got amp. So that gives us a little bit more of that lo-fi thing. And now with this EQing, this is where we start to get a lot closer, right? So we've got, Got these EQ moves going on. Erosion really adds to this too. It's really subtle, but it gives you that like almost that lo-fi like speaker box kind of effect, like you're listening to something through like an old crappy radio. This combination of like layering EQ8s with this particular curve that I've got going on, as well as erosion, really kind of got me to the place I was looking to get. And so we keep going here, so kind of approaching, you know, the end of the tunnel with it. And again, like some of these curves, like making up for, you know, this double dip that I've got going on here in these two EQs. I'm kind of returning a little bit of that after we've got this erosion effect going. Then there's more erosion. Again, it's just starting to get a little bit wider. I really like this wide noise setting on erosion. It really helps to kind of like put things outside of mono without resorting to a reverb or a delay or something. And then we've got Saturn. And this is like, if I'm being real here, Saturn is really where things start to get interesting because, I don't know, there's just something about being able to play with these like tone faders, and then where you've got your crossover for each distortion band, you can really tailor some stuff in here. So even just like, let's go back for a second. Maybe we'll even just loop this intro. So here's without Saturn, and there's... Like, I remember the moment I put Saturn on there and I got that curve right, I was like, okay, like now we're cooking. This is like 90-ish% there. So we've got that. And then there's just like some last little final EQ moves I've got going on here, just to kind of, again, like push up frequencies that I'm hearing and knock down other ones that I'm not hearing as much of. And then we've also got, we've also got another EQ last in the chain here. And again, this is, again, just making room for things, pushing things up in different spots. Like I've got this like high boost here around 4K, that overlapping with this 7K boost, just kind of like, again, it just sits it in the right spot. That's pretty much it. And then there was one final little tone shaping EQ at the end, and this sounds like this. So to me, it was just a little too boxy. That's a little closer to what it is on the record. So that was the lead sound. At the very least, that's how I kind of went about recreating it. There still exists a couple of things that aren't quite right with it. There is this unmistakable sort of lo-fi, it almost sounds like it could be like low bit depth tonal things going on with it, kind of in the way that an MPC would affect sound or would affect anything that you record into it. So this kind of has that, and I know, or at least I've read, that Liam Howlett was using a lot of like the Akai 900, the Akai 1000, right? Those samplers have this very particular tonality to them, and I think that has a lot to do with the filtering and the, you know, the recording quality and all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of where I ended up with the lead. The next thing is the drum fill that takes the song in, this guy. So not really much to say about this. It's one of those things where, like, for instance, like I was saying about Serum and trying to recreate the lead sound, that took probably the better part of a day. It probably took me anywhere between 3 hours, 4 hours. That was all I ended up working on for that day. And then I put the session away and I came back to it. So the sort of contrast between working on something like that, where you're really getting tweaky and like working the finer details, to then go searching for a sample. With samples, it's like once you hear it, you know it. There's no question about what it is or where it goes, right? So this sample, it's just this. That's how the song starts, or at least the Johnny the Fox, that's how it starts on the record. And so very simply what I did was I just grabbed one of the snares from in here. I'm pretty sure, is it the last one? Or maybe it was this one. Anyway, I grabbed one of them and just put it at the start, so we have the bap, 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 and we get that like snare roll that goes into it. And that was it. That was literally it. And then just matching the tone a little bit. So we've got a little bit of saturation. I'm doubling up on that. I'm sort of cutting the dry wet mix in half. Even though I'm adding more drive, I'm cutting the amount of it that's mixed in. And then just some general EQ, pushing up some high end, some high mids, cutting a bunch of lows, you know, like really trying to make the space for it so that we don't have a bunch of low end in the sample that we don't need. And also that's how it sounds on the record to me. And then we jump right into the song, and pretty much the rest of the arrangement comes into view. There are a bunch of things that come in at the same time. So there's many ways we could go from here, but I think the most applicable or the most appropriate would be this Paul 162 loop, because this is kind of where the whole song lives. And everything else in the track is kind of based off of this one loop. So here it is. That's like where everything else takes its cue from. And especially with this fill sample. This fill sample comes every 4 bars. And so it is kind of inextricably linked to this Paul 162 thing. So listening to those two together, you'll kind of get the feel, right? Because there's that little micro point where it cuts out, and then we get, and then it comes back in, right? Very classic. This song is so unbelievably 90s. It reminds me of so much from that era. And then there's a couple of other things that kind of revolve around this loop, and it's all in service to what's going on. This sample here, the Little Richard, I didn't end up using that, so I'm actually just going to minimize it. If we solo up the kick, you'll hear how it's based off of that loop. This loop isn't exactly perfect. I'm pretty sure it's not quantized on the original recording. So a lot of these kicks have been placed in a spot where they need to go relative to the beat, and then some of them either get nudged, or there's also, I'm pretty sure I've got a groove. Yeah, so I've got a swing MPC groove going on this. What is it? 61. Okay, so yeah, you could go one way or the other. You could physically move every one and line it up with the original sample, or you could pick a groove that kind of gets close, and I think that's what I did here with this kick, as well as the snare drum. And that's another part of the groove which is so undeniable, is the fact that there's this backbeat snare that's like, a very classic drum and bass kind of thing. And this particular sample as well, I think it's just a random Dr. Dre sample, something that I thought was close to what happened in the original song. But the way they all work together, again, like a lot of them they're very in line with, so like here's our snare, and here's our loop. They're very close together. They line up pretty much right on the money. And I'm pretty sure that there's a groove on this. Yeah, so probably that same 61 MPC. Yeah. So our main Paul 162 loop, our Thin Lizzy loop, drum fill kind of thing, and then our kick and our snare all together sound like this. There it is. Like that's 90% of the way there, I would think. There are a couple of hi-hats that come in. There's one 8th note hi-hat that I hear, and then there's also an offbeat. So bringing in that offbeat hat sounds like this. And a lot of these samples, like you really go digging for them. Like you can see that like this one's an Alchemist hat, this one's an Alchemist hat, this is a Dr. Dre one. But realistically, if you have a 909 version of something, like if you have a 909 drum kit of some variety, a lot of these samples originate from the 909. This kick is a very 909 kick. You can kind of get a 909 snare to sound like this. A lot of these hi-hats are unmistakably 909 samples. And then we have this other Alchemist hat down here, which is, again, I'm pretty sure just a version of a 909. That's pretty much our drum bit. That's what we're working with. We bring in the lead sound, the serum lead, and we've got this. Right? Now we're in the ballpark. And then the other thing that comes in, which, foundationally is probably a really important thing to touch on, is the bass. There is actually a bass underneath all of this, which is, it's funny, when I would listen to the song as a kid, I always thought it was like just a guy finger picking, on one note, like on an actual bass guitar. Come to find that it's literally just a sine wave that's being, plucked around and just has like an envelope, a very simple, basic, stock envelope. A little bit of distortion here, some filtering there, no effects, no real automation or LFO assignments or anything like that. It's literally a sine wave, and the only processing I've got going on is this one just gigantic boost at 150. And you'll see what I mean with that boost. Like so here, check it out. We'll check out our whole arrangement, and I'll bring the bass in after one loop. So check this out. No bass. And now we'll bring the bass in. It's just that one line. It's crazy. The bass on its own sounds like this. Yeah, and there's that one little pitch envelope move, this little dip up. That's it's literally the only thing going on other than the fact that it's just a barrage of 16th notes. So yeah, and then there's this one processing thing. So check this out. It's amazing to me how like something like this would just be sacrilege in today's mixing climate. Like you wouldn't just whack up a bunch of 150 for no reason, but this is what makes this sound like it's part of the record. So like check this out. No boost sounds like this. Sounds all right. And especially in the track too. Like check it out with and without in the track. So here's without. And here's with. It's crazy to me how something so quote unquote wrong from a mixing perspective is actually what makes it sound like it belongs. It's really weird. In terms of that sort of main intro part where things are kind of starting to come in, things are being introduced, blah, blah, blah. The next thing is just a 909 crash. 909s are kind of the flavor of the week here. And this is very simply just a 909 crash I grabbed from a pack. Grab your closest 909 crash cymbal to you and use that. And then also this horn stab, this quintessentially 90s horn stab. Check this out. You know, it's like something you would hear in like a Fishbone song or something. Like, yeah, it's just so emblematic of that time period. I remember hearing horns like that on records as a kid, like everywhere. It seemed like everyone was doing like breakbeat style drums, horn samples that were very modulated with like chorus and tight delays and stuff like that. There's a lot of very like really aggressive abundance of low mid in bass. There were a lot of really weird kind of conventions of that time that made it what it was. So we've got that horn stab. The next one that everyone is always so curious about is the sword sounds. And it's literally just it's two sounds from the beginning of Mystery of Chessboxing by Wu-Tang. And it's when you throw them in the track, you're just like, oh yeah, that, right. Okay, so we get a couple more things coming. Also, I realized this is actually supposed to be there as well. It's interesting once you start getting into the minutia of what makes up a track and you hear something, you're like, no, wait, that's not right. I just realized with the crashes over here. So the first one gets reversed and pitched up, and then it kind of comes down to the pitch of the regular direction crash cymbal. But there's this little space in between them, and you can hear it on the record. Like it takes a moment and then it stops and then you hear the crash. It's not just a classic, crossfade into the other crash cymbal kind of vibe. So yeah, we have this 909 crash that gets reversed before it goes into the main crash. We've got the sword sounds from Chessboxing, and there's a couple of other things that come in too. This wah guitar, this was the only thing that I actually could not locate the original sample for. There were a lot of people that were saying it's Rage Against the Machine or it's an old Paul Coffey recording or something like that. No matter what I did, I couldn't find anything that really resembled this to a T. And so what I elected to do was to just find a wah sample that was close and really kind of like try to force the mix on it. So that sounds like this. And really all that is just a little bit of amp. We've got saturator pushing up a bunch of drive, we've got a compressor, and then really this thing is where it's at, this massive peak at like 1.7. That's really what's giving it that like spiky, like ice picky kind of thing. And this is usually a no-go zone again for mixing. Like you don't want to be ramping up. Like what am I even doing here? Like 11 dB on a really tight Q parametric band at 1.7, like, at a festival, like that's going to take your ears off, right? Like that's going to ruin you on a large system, but that's what it needed. So we've got this, but in the track, it all makes sense, right? Cool. So we've got that wah guitar thing. And then the only other thing that actually did come from a meter song. It's funny, on here it says the John Barry Orchestra, but it's actually a meter song. This one hi-hat, it's actually like a snare and a hi-hat together, but in digging around, I was, someone said, oh, there's a sample from a meter song in there. And listening to the original track, I was like, I don't hear anything by the meters. And so someone said, no, it's this song. It's Here Comes the Meter Man. Yeah. Someone said, no, there's a hi-hat from Here Comes the Meter Man. And so I listened all the way through and I'm like, I'm not hearing anything until this one spot. And I was like, oh my God, that's it. And it's literally just this one hi-hat sound through reverb, right? With like a really big pre-delay. And when I originally heard this in the song, I thought it was like, some Foley thing, like Foley spaceship, something they would use on Star Wars or something, just because I don't know what it is about it, but it has that quality to me. Like, check it out in the track for a sec. Yeah, I don't know what it is about it, but it has this kind of otherworldly quality to it. Getting these pieces in place really kind of like set off the excitement. Battling away, trying to do a recreation of this variety can be really, really depressing at times. Doing this lead part, I thought you're in the third hour of like trying stuff and you're just getting nowhere. And you're like, man, should I really keep doing this? Like, maybe I should pack it in. And then there's that one thing that sets it off. And you're like, okay, yeah, no, I'm in. Let's go. Getting a lot of these samples in place too, it's the same thing where you know what it is you need to hear, but the search of it is just this perilous, never-ending thing until you get it. So everything from here on out is kind of just a variation. There isn't really anything totally new except for this guitar thing, and there's a little glass breaking sound. So the guitar part, if we jump to the B section, it sounds like this. I played around with using a couple of different UAD amplifiers and tried some wave stuff. Even my own amplifiers in my studio here. Like, I've tried a bunch of different stuff to get this tone. And what I just ended up realizing was that it's not a good tone. Like, it's not a great guitar tone. In fact, it's a very bad guitar tone on its own. In isolation, this would be just, you would hear it and you'd be like, I would never put that on a record. There's no way. But that's actually kind of the reason it works, is because of how kind of irreverent it is about the like where it belongs. So, looking at what I could do to get this tone going, I was like, I need things that don't sound good. I need things that sound deliberately bad. And it's not that Ableton's amp plugin doesn't sound good, but it sounds more like it's bad than it sounds like it's good, if you know what I mean. It needs a lot of really fizzy distortion for this part. So I've got the amp on the lead setting, gain's pretty up, a lot of the controls are pretty up, mid, treble, presence. Bass is down a bit. We're going into a cabinet. It's interesting. I moved the dry wet down a bit, and I remember now, the reason for this is that with the dry wet all the way up, a guitar speaker cabinet is going to cut a lot of high end, and often a lot of that brash stuff that's above like 5, 6, 7K that's just fizz. Guitars actually don't really benefit from frequencies in that spectrum. In fact, the majority of guitar that you hear on records is only really between like 100 and 5K. There isn't really much that lives outside of those parts of the spectrum. So because this is such a fizzy part, I actually elected to back off the cabinet a little bit just to give a little bit more of that fizziness. Also, this pedal, same thing, like really trying to feed the amp with a bunch of distortion and then also have the amp producing a bunch of distortion. So we get this palette of fizziness, and then to kind of mix that to taste by rolling off the dry wet on the cabinet. That was kind of my move here. And then beyond that, just the tonal properties, just kind of getting the EQ right. There's a big dip in the mid here. Here's the amp on its own. Like, it does not sound good. That is not a great amp sound. It's a very bad amp sound. And then we've got pedal. So this is that distortion thing. So we're going to get a lot more distortion. Right. And so that's that fizzy thing that I was telling you about. So with cabinet, a lot of that fizzy is going to go away, but because it's not totally wet, we are going to hear just a little bit of it. Right. So just, reining in that fizzy. So if I were to roll this all the way up, right, like if we were to go to 100, See how that fizzy is gone now, right? So I rolled it back down, so we get a little bit of it back. EQ8, just dipping some mids, cutting some lows, cutting some highs, but then also a bit of a high boost to sort of like tame the fizz, but also keep it present. So that's with, that's without. Like it just reins it in a little bit. Like we're not getting right to the, you know, super tippy top of the frequency spectrum. It's still staying within, it has barriers. And then the last thing was just what are the spatial qualities of it? Does it sound like it's in a room? Does it sound like it's dry? Where in between, you know, that kind of thing. And I noticed that there's actually a pretty significant room slap kind of delay on this sound. So and it also helps to kind of seed it in the track. Here, I'll take the delay off and we'll play the track again. Like it sounds a little too dry. And so then we get the delay on it. Yeah, because it's one of the only things that's providing space, it has this sensation that there are other things that kind of take space from it. In other words, it kind of tricks you into thinking that there are other elements in the song that have space on them. Like for instance, with this guitar and then also thinking about how the drums sound next to it, it almost tricks you into thinking there's space on the drums. And this is something that I find in my own productions I get kind of caught chasing my tail with sometimes, is having too much space on too many things. In a lot of cases, things that you're just adding ambient space to, there's probably a good 60 to 80% of that stuff that you don't need any space on at all, because the space is kind of shared amongst other things that really need it more. And I'm not talking about things that can only be achieved by having an absurd amount of space. Like, you know, in a dance context, you hear like a clap with like a cavern reverb after it, like that kind of thing. You can't get away with doing that without having a reverb with a long decay time. But, you know, just like I said, ambient space, like wanting your drums to sound like they're in a room, you don't necessarily have to send your drums to a room or put reverb on them. You know, you could very simply take the, say like the percussion layer that you've got going on, like say tambourines and shakers and things like that, throw that to a room reverb, and all of a sudden it sounds like all of your drums are in a room. There's one other thing to show you, which is this glass breaking. And again, I don't know if this is the exact sample from the song. It's probably not. But I've always noticed that when they switch over to this B section, it sounds like someone's like breaking a beer bottle on the ground. So here's that transition. Right? Anyway, this is the totality of my recreation of Breathe. Beyond just going through the tracks and, you know, kind of having a look at everything and checking things out and, you know, what choices I made regarding processing and samples and you know, where samples are coming from and stuff like that. I think in the macro sense, this song was really valuable to me to recreate because it is a masterclass in sampling. I would even argue that the work Liam Howlett did on this is right up there with the hip hop royalty like Jay Dilla and Pete Rock and like all of these guys that are just absolute masters of the craft of sampling. This exemplifies all of the same attributes to me. It's really in making these sample, like the way in which they're orchestrated makes it sound like it's a band, like there are people sharing space. One place that this is really evident to me is in the second half of this sort of first A section. And so we spend the first half sort of getting introduced to every part. It's not like they, you know, throw everything at you right at the beginning. So, you know, we get ushered in with this drum fill. These horns are sort of the first auxiliary thing that we hear. And then more things get introduced. We get this sword sound, and then that mixes with the horn thing. And then once we get to this part, there's the introduction of two more parts, but there is space being made for them. The thing I love about this is that we've got the sword sounds. Those sword sounds get answered by the wah guitar, and then the wah guitar gets answered by this meters hi-hat thing. But based on our old pattern of these sword sounds, this thing would trample over all of these parts of the sound. And so what's happened is they've been taken away. There's been room made for this hi-hat thing. And then we go through that whole similar pattern again where we have sword sounds, wah guitar, hi-hat thing. But now the thing that puts the period on that is our Thin Lizzy drum fill and backwards 909 crash, leaning us right back in. So the samples are, in their own kind of way, they're telling a bit of a story. This is really being creative with samples and using them in a way that you would a melody or the arrangement within a band. It's an amazing thing. I would not have discovered this about the song had I not sat down and tried to recreate it. So yeah, that is my recreation of Breathe by Prodigy. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for sticking around. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing and also hitting the notification bell so you can be notified when more videos like this come out. I really enjoyed making this. I really enjoyed talking about the process. My name is Jordan. Hopefully we'll see you soon on another Giordash Recreates. Thank you so much.